All right, welcome to this week's live office hours. We're mixing it up. Casey's unfortunately out sick, so Finn's jumping in the seat here.
Hey everyone, nice to see
Awesome.
everyone.
Yeah, so we're gonna same format here, but Casey and I were talking about something last week, which was like this concept of mental models. And Finn, I'm not sure if you saw, but I was basically geeking out with like Farnham Street. Are you familiar with Farnham Street at all?
Less so. Less
Okay.
that.
I feel like you're a finance major. A lot of the finance majors, like in my class, were like really into it. So fs.blog is the URL. And I was basically just walking through these different mental models because a lot of people don't know about mental models. And my experience thus far in the Amazon world in like a decade plus at this point has been we don't follow good mental models. And I'll define what a mental model is in a moment. And actually, I'll just do it now. A mental model basically is a structured way of thinking, right? We internally use the term first principles quite a lot. It's part of our culture. It's part of the values we have as a company. But like, what is first principles and what's the inverse of first principles? Well, the inverse of first principles is just what's always been done. What's always been done that way. Okay, well, just because it's always been done that way, is that necessarily the right way to do it? First principles takes that a step further and says, let's get to the grounded truth. And so a good example of how to do that is the Socratic questioning method. So you ask why 5 times. Okay, well, we do it this way. Well, why? Well, because Jim instituted that. Well, why did he do it? I don't know. Okay, it already broke. We're already not using first principles. And so I was geeking out with all these because, I mean, listen, there's every subject in the world has a set of mental models that they operate in. And you go anywhere from biology, chemistry, software engineering, like doesn't matter. But what's interesting is these things generalize so well. And I was joking last week in office hours, oh, I should write a blog post on like the ones I think are the most impactful to sellers. And so that's what we did. So yesterday, we actually released this. I'm going to share my screen. We're going to walk through this a little bit for people. So I initially thought I was going to pick 3 and I couldn't pick 3 because there's like so many good ones. But I still wanted it to be as succinct as possible. So I picked, I think, the most impactful 6 mental models for sellers and how to use them in context, right? Because sometimes people struggle to take this like concept and then apply it to our own world. So I try to do that in this blog post. So I just want to walk through a few of these kind of high level. Obviously the blog's here if you want to read the whole thing. But when I talk a lot on podcasts and webinars and stuff about like, I want you to think differently. Sometimes it's hard for me to convey what I mean by that and why it's important. And so I think this blog post really answers both those questions. So first and foremost, the sellers that are doing incredibly well are making different decisions than you are. It's rarely the case that they just have copious amounts more of capital than you do, at least like at the same level, right? And it's not necessarily that they always have more time. And we'll talk about leverage because that's one of the models here. It's really how are they utilizing these things and making smart decisions. So here's a great example. And I intentionally started with this mental model called the map is not the territory. When you think of a map, Matthew, how's it going? I'm going to give you a little highlight here. What's up? When you think of a map, like a physical map, does it encompass everything there? No, it's a abstraction. It is a simplification of the thing that is there. So if I give you a map of Florida, is that everything? Of course not. Can't do it. It's too complex. Well, if we conceptualize this a little bit further, we can basically say, well, is the story that other sellers are giving me true reality? No. 1, they don't have enough sample size, so how could it ever be? And 2, that's their own lived experience. And how can you assume that they have discovered every nook and cranny and subtle nuance of being a seller? It's very difficult to do. And so I started with this one because I think it really highlights that at a conceptual level, but also how tools work in this world. So just because, you know, I mentioned like Jungle Scout, Helium 10, these are great tools, awesome tools, but it's a simplification of what is true. That's just how it works, right? That's what software does intentionally. You have to really get good at finding that grounded truth of how things actually work. And this is where first principles thinking, which is why it's number 2 here, comes into play. This is how you actually work through this. So yeah, here's a good version of this. Tools and data are helpful guides, but they are not perfect. The real territory includes things no tool can fully capture, aka your experience. So I think you can get to 80% of being an incredible seller within a few weeks by just hearing what everybody else is saying. That gives you like a good foundation. The last 20% is your own experience. Nobody can give that to you. No course can give that to you. Even, this is why people course hop time and time again. Well, I need more knowledge. What you don't realize is that 80% of the knowledge you need to succeed is probably wrapped up in 1, if not 2 courses. But that last 20% you're trying to discover is through the work itself. And this is creating your own map. I hope I'm not butchering this. So now, first principles is how you kind of get there, right? A lot of people will be like, oh, stay away from this category. It's horrible. Okay. Well, that's not first principles thinking. First principles thinking would go deeper and say, well, why is it horrible? Well, because of this. Well, why is that a thing? And you go deeper and deeper. And by doing so, you uncover things that other sellers are unwilling to look at. A good example, when we were first building repricing with Aura, the legacy version, everybody knew price tanking was horrible. And if you reprice below by a penny, you're a horrible human being. That was the general consensus. But we put that to the test. We said, okay, well, let's think about this from first principles perspective. Let's look at the data. What is true? And we find out, yeah, that can be abused, but there's actually a good segment of time where you should intentionally do that. And that's not a horrible thing. It's the right thing to do. So by using first principles, we find a more nuanced answer to something that gives us a performance boost. And that's one simple thing. A lot of people said when I was getting started with wholesale, you need tens of thousands of dollars to get started. That was just the general consensus. But when I started to do it and I didn't have tens of thousands of dollars of capital, I started to notice the MOQs, the minimum order quantities, were like 100, 500 units, and they were negotiable. So in reality, using first principles, you can get started with wholesale for like $1,000, like depending on what you're targeting. And you know what I mean? So it's one of these things where like when you start to think through these different lenses, it shifts your perspective and helps you operate very different. The other one I cover here is second order thinking. A lot of people do what's called first order. If I do X, Y will happen. Okay. But if Y happens, what is Z? It's where a lot of people get stuck. They don't think, and you can take this out to fifth order, although that's exponentially more complicated. But second order is so impactful because it lets you see a few steps ahead. When people say, and I used to say this all the time, play chess, not checkers. When you're playing checkers, you're pretty much playing first order. It's pretty straightforward. When you're playing chess, you have to be thinking second, if not more orders. Because if I do X, I can assume you're going to do Y, but what if you do Z? What am I going to do because of that? Like that's where, and you could do this in business pretty well too. This is just, it's going to help you with positioning, things of that nature. And I give a few examples here. And by the way, all these I link out to Farnham Street. They have blog posts that go way more in depth on each of these. I just wanted to kind of give you an introduction to each one of these. Next one here is inversion. I think this one's super impactful too. And I use this with the section 3s actually, because a lot of people are like, oh, Amazon hates us. Okay, well, let's use first principles, right? Let's actually get to the root of reality here and let's invert it. Why would they do it? And then when you start to dig, you're like, oh, they have a lot of external regulatory pressure. There's a lot of things happening. It's not that they hate us and they're horrible. It's that they're under a lot of pressure and they have to react to that. And the second order of them doing that is section 3s. Okay, so already we're using a combination of these mental models to understand what is happening. Right? So you can take a problem, invert and say, what's the opportunity in the problem? You can also do the inverse, right? You can say, well, here's a great opportunity. What's the problem in the opportunity? So I did this with sourcing. Instead of looking for reasons to buy inventory, I inverted it and said, what are the reasons I should not buy inventory and I looked for those red flags. Instead of looking for green flags, I looked for red flags. And by doing so, I avoided being stupid. It's basically what occurred. And exactly here, right? Thinking about how to fail. So if you look at Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, a lot of what they talk about in their memos is, I'm not trying to be the smartest one. I'm trying not to be stupid. Because if I can just not be stupid, I can be smart enough to succeed. Very different approach. A lot of people are out here like, I'm just going to crush it. Sure, that's awesome. Be motivated, be ambitious, all those things. But write out a list of how you could be dumb. How could you ruin this? Now avoid all those things. Right? It's just, again, it's just flipping the problem. And then leverage is the last one here, or I'm sorry, second to last one. We talk a lot about leverage using virtual assistants, but leverage is a whole broad topic. And it's one of the things that I am trying to get much better at because there's different forms of leverage. There's technology, there's capital, there's people. And people is not just hiring VAs, it's also your network. Can you send one text when you have the biggest problem of your life to one person who's already solved that and they can solve it for you in 2 seconds? Than you spending 4 weeks trying to figure it out. That's people leverage. So you want to be thinking through these multipliers is what they are. So when you're thinking about scaling the business, you want to understand, okay, well, I've got one of 2 things. I've got the biggest growth lever that if I pull that lever, I will have the biggest growth. But I also probably have an equal biggest bottleneck lever. What's holding me back? That's the inversion. Right? So if I can understand what's the single most impactful thing I could do and how do I apply leverage to that? And how can I apply leverage to removing my biggest bottleneck? How faster could I scale? Probably much faster. When you're getting started as a seller, you tend to have a sourcing problem, less of a capital problem. But as you solve the sourcing problem, now you have a capital problem. Now you're able to source more than you can afford. So now you understand, okay, well, my bottleneck is capital. There's a bunch of different ways you can apply leverage to solve that problem. You can raise money, take on debt. You can even just be more intentional about the efficiency of your capital expenditures, all kinds of cool stuff. And sometimes your growth lever and your bottleneck are the same thing. Now, the other side is activation energy. This one's kind of interesting. Sourcing is not the most stimulating thing in the world. Let's be honest. Finn, I know you've done it. It's a grind, man, right?
Yes.
So activation energy, this comes from chemistry. So there's a minimal amount of something that's called the activation energy to create a result, if you will, or a reaction. Same thing works with humans. So instead of being like, I want to build a $5 million a year business, break it down, make it smaller, right? If we can fractionalize this problem, break it down into bite-sized chunks, we're reducing the activation energy of just getting started. Because a lot of times we have this amorphous, massive thing we want to accomplish and we don't know how to get started. But when you break it down, you make it easier to get started. All of a sudden, you got momentum behind you. So when you put all these, or go ahead, Finn, you had a comment.
No, I was just going to say I had an English teacher like in high school that used to tell us like once begun, half done. Like getting started was like half of the, like just like getting the momentum, going from 0 to 1 is like half of it. And then once you're at 1, then it's maintaining it. And so
exactly.
That's and I've always carried that with me through a lot of things, like spanning all types of like projects, like in school and now here with Aura. It's like once you start something, like then it's already in motion. It's keeping it in motion.
Exactly.
Same thing in terms of like growing an Amazon business too. Sourcing might seem like just the biggest mountain and like an endless void of phone calls and emails and like hearing no's. But it's like once you're doing it, you realize a lot of the anticipation of doing it and failing. Once that's out of the way and you're doing it, that momentum is kind of like self-propelling in a sense.
Yeah.
So at 100%.
Like switching to wholesale is an overwhelming thing because now you're going to pick up the phone, call, get rejections. And instead of worrying about, well, I need to build like a successful wholesale business, you break it down as minute as possible and say, I just need to call one brand today. I call one supplier. That's progress. And it is. And then you get that momentum behind you. So what happens when you put all this together? Well, you end up checking your assumptions, which this alone is incredible. You break your problems down into what actually matters. You're thinking long-term. So you're making smart, intelligent decisions. This is strategy, by the way. You're avoiding obvious mistakes by not being stupid, for lack of a better term. You're applying multipliers, aka leverage, and you're making it easy to do. This is why I could not reduce this list even further. I wanted it to be like the top 3. I couldn't do it. And listen, there's like hundreds of mental models. But I think for sellers, based on my experience, these 6, if you were to really understand these and apply these intentionally, game changer, total game changer. So yeah, this blog post is up here. This basically just gives you a brief overview of what is this mental model. Give me some examples. And then if you want to go deeper into understanding it, there's a link in each one of these to a blog post that goes far more in depth with far more examples than I could do. Farnham Street is amazing. They have absolutely tons of these things. So there's a whole mental model section, and you see general thinking, physics, chemistry, biology, systems, numeracy. I can never say that word. I always want to say numerology for some reason. Microeconomics, military war, human nature, and judgment. And that's not even all of them. These are just the ones that they've covered. So it's a never ending list, but there's some amazing, amazing stuff in here. Do I think you need to understand all those? Of course not. I certainly don't. But I think if you have these 6 locked down, you're probably in a really, really good spot. Awesome. So listen, this is open office hours. I just wanted to geek out because I know we talked about mental models last week and there was some interest in that. So I did put together a whole blog post on that. I just want to highlight it with you guys, especially if you weren't here last week, you kind of get an idea of that. But yeah, we'll start diving into some questions and we'll geek out for the remainder of the time. See John here, does Maven do anything when we enter a map price? So it does not. So map is, that input field is for reference purposes only. That's very much by design because you don't always want to follow map. Take that as you will. Listen, you do whatever you want to do. And sometimes honestly, like your min price is above your map. That can happen, although far less, but it does. We have been talking internally about possibly in the strategy settings saying, listen, if my min is greater than my map, follow my min. If my map is, or if my min is lower than my map, follow my map. So we are talking about introducing some kind of conditional logic in the strategies themselves. That way it's still a reference point, but it's more dynamic, if that makes sense, in terms of like when we decide to use it. So we are talking about that a lot.
Yeah, it's actionable right now. It's a like a static field, like just for reference. The best way to ensure that Aura is going to follow map is to manually set your map as your min price. That's assuming you want to follow it. At that point in time, the strategy will, it'll continue to reprice as the strategy calls for it, but you'll be ensuring that it stays at or above your map at all times. That assumes you want to follow map too. Otherwise, if you just want to remain at map and not like have any price movements, that might be a use case for like toggling or pricing off on that specific listing, or setting a very tight minimax boundary on that if you want to manually set the max price too. But to make sure map is enforced would just entail manually setting your min price to map.
Yep. Let's see, what is a map? Yeah, great question. So MAP is an acronym for minimum advertised price. So when you're dealing with, especially wholesale, so if you're dealing with brands, suppliers, what have you, distributors even, they will sometimes include this value. And it's basically just saying you're not allowed to sell below this price point. Like we're all in agreement. That's the floor. So to be honest, there are times when people do not follow MAP. We're not going to tell you how to run your business.
We're not the map police.
We're not the map police, exactly. But again, there are times where your min price, the way you calculate it, let's say 30% minimum ROI, is greater than the map. So sometimes you actually want to be above that. So it really just depends. On some wholesale listings, if there is a map, you're basically just selling at map and that's it.
So
That's my, yeah. And that's my experience. So really just depends. See, Thomas Tran, what's going on, man? I haven't talked to you in a hot minute. Appreciate you jumping
about
in.
map is, it's like you would know, if a product has a map, usually it's some sort of clause or contract that comes along with like, ordering a specific like SKU from a certain supplier. Usually it's some sort of contractual agreement where, you agree not to price beneath map because, well, they don't want you undercutting like their other like sales channels, and to like prevent like dilution of like the brand and pricing. That's been my experience.
You can also typically on wholesale listings see it on Keepa because it's just everybody goes to one and it just holds forever. So you'll basically see the number of competitors fluctuate, but the price will just hold steady. That pretty much tells you its map. Let's see. Vehi, I understand that business pricing is a requested feature, but I'm curious to know the reasons behind Orr's decision not to implement it at this time. Alternatively, I'd like to know if it's included in your future plans. So it is something we're talking about. The reason why we're not actively working on it is because welcome to running a software company. You want to do, we have to decide, we basically have to create a impact list of things we can work on and sort those by impact. So where, listen, if we had unlimited capacity tomorrow, we do have capacity. We do have, unfortunately, we're not at a place where we can have AI write code that's really good. We're not there yet. I'm praying for it for sure. But right now there are more impactful features and larger projects that we are working on that will have a much greater impact than doing that for now. So it is something we talk about quite a bit. It's just when we stack rank everything, it doesn't come in at the top, just to be transparent with you there. It's something I think we will do, but I mean, listen, Walmart has become the #1 requested thing, period. We have sellers that are going multi-channel. We have sellers that are leaving Amazon and going straight to Walmart, especially some of your smaller sellers, where the hit to velocity doesn't really impact them as much as, the positive impact to the profit margin. So we are thinking about that kind of stuff as well. So we're very strategic with how we decide what to work on. Again, going to second order, first principles, all these mental models we've been geeking out with, leverage, exactly. So we use the stuff we're talking about here, but it is definitely on the table. I can't give you an ETA because we don't have one. But as we get closer to working on that, we'll definitely let you know because we'll need beta testers for it. That's for sure. Let's see, Vehi. Also on the map, it needs to be enforced almost every time off Amazon. That is my experience. That's correct. So typically when you have a map agreement, usually when you create the relationship with the brand, and typically this is with a brand, I see this far less with distributors, although it certainly can happen. You are agreeing in the map agreement, it's its own document usually, that no matter where you sell, that is the minimum advertised price. Is it possible that you have a Amazon specific map? Maybe. I rarely see that. It's usually just like, listen, period, where you sell it, we don't care, but like you're not going below this price. That could also include eBay as an example.
It's a condition of like being able to resell like their product is like you must, it's like you mustn't undercut us or our other like sales channels. And if you do, then, usually they're not very happy about it. Some people have like a strike policy. Others have like zero tolerance and, they may like close your account, like worst case. But again, it's like some people choose to break map and, we can't control that.
I mean, I have personally broke map. I had a good relationship with the brand, smaller brand, following map, not a problem. They were also on the listing. And, we had a discussion about it. It was not a problem. Internally, they changed their mind and wanted to take more of the lion's share of Amazon because they saw how good it was going. And instead of working with their sellers, which there's only a small handful of us, they decided that they didn't have a map agreement themselves, so they could do whatever they wanted. So they went a few pennies below map and owned everything. So I straight up told them, listen, if that's what we're going to do, I'm breaking map. Like, you can't sue me for it. It is what it is. I understand I'm losing the account if I do that, but like, I've already lost the listing at this point. Like you basically sour the and they still don't like me for it. But listen, at the end of the day, you do have to sometimes make decisions that are good for your business when a relationship sours, and it's not always your fault. You know what I mean? So I've intentionally done that. I basically just removed Map and said, great, I'm going to compete directly with you now because you've completely changed the dynamics, and I would never reorder from you anyway. So it's either I liquidate this inventory, get my capital back, or just let it sit there, which I'm not going to do. So sometimes you got to do what you got to do.
Uneven playing field.
Yeah. And that just comes, you know, you can have a great relationship with a brand directly, and things internally can change. Their CEO can come in and be like, I want to own all of it. And the CEO is going to be like, I don't care that we have Map pricing with them. Whatever. It's our brand. True. True. So it is what it is. See, can you explain the hyperdrive feature? Yes. So we've always had instant rate pricing, but instant doesn't technically mean instant. It doesn't mean we're lying. What it means, though, is in our system, it is instant, what we can control. Now, when I submit a price update to Amazon via the API, on average, it's going to take 1.5 to 2 minutes round trip before it's actually confirmed in live. That's on average. Like Q4, that could be like 10, 15 minutes.
That's industry standard.
Yeah, exactly. So anybody who has instant, same thing. It's all the same limitation. Basically, it's the Amazon bottleneck. Now, we found a unique way to do that full round trip in less than 10 seconds. Now, we can only do this up to 50 SKUs in parallel per account period. So we do have a credit system. So depending on what tier you're on, you get different, hyperdrive credits. But the most, you can pay me $10,000 a month, you're still only getting 50. Because what happens is there's an engineering limitation. Now, what's really cool about that is how we do it is highly complicated. How you make it happen as a user is you click one button. You hit the toggle, say do it. And we say, great, gotcha. So for listings where speed matters, in a better way to think about when to apply this is listings where there's a ton of competition and a lot of pricing activity. So think toys in Q4. Got a lot of sellers on those listings. Speed matters. Being in the buy box an extra, 5 minutes per hour would meaningfully impact sales. That's when you're going to want to use it. So if you have less listings than the number of hyperdrive credits you have, apply it to everything. You have nothing to lose. There's no downside.
It can only help you. It can only help you.
Exactly. Now, when you start to have to make trade-off decisions because you have more listings than hyperdrive credits you have, that's when you want to start saying, okay, well, which listings are highly competitive? There's a lot of people updating their price. That's where we want to use that for. So it's not just purely that there's a lot of competition, because I use competition very nuanced. When I say number of competitors, it's not just the number of sellers on a listing. It's the number of people that are actively competing, because you could have 20 sellers on a listing, but let's say 10 of them have a super high price and they never update their price.
Yeah.
I do not consider those as competition. They're in the market, but they're not competing. The other 10, if those other 10 are actively updating their pricing in real time, that's my competition. So as that active number of competitors increases, that's when I start to pay attention and want to use hyperdrive.
No, in the app itself, we say on your most critical listings, and it's very subjective.
Yeah.
It may be the ones with the lowest sales rank. It may, but it doesn't have to be. It's the ones where, remember, like the big value add is that hyperdrive is able to outpace other competitors in terms of the speed that we change your prices. Right. So, effectively, what we're doing is, if we can update your price in under 10 seconds and somebody else who's using instant repricing can do it in, 1.5 to 2 minutes, you are effectively rendering them ineffective by the time that we update your price. By the time they respond to it, that price update's already obsolete. That is the real value add, is that we are able to effectively come in and update your price faster than they can even process it. Yeah. Which is a huge game changer, especially in Q4.
So in theory, your competition, not using hyperdrive, which we're the only company who has it, is actually maybe only reacting to a quarter of the price changes you're making. Like that's like we could have repriced 3 times in the span it took them to respond to the 4th one ago.
Right. Exactly.
Which is crazy. Let's see. Don't worry, Vihi. We won't ignore it. I'm curious. Also on transparency codes now on Amazon, if they find that you don't use them on all manufactured products, regardless of the market they are being sold in, you get into trouble. That's actually good to know.
Interesting.
I'm not super well up on my transparency codes, if I'm being honest. But I dig it. Yeah, there's a lot of things shifting right now. The whole bundling, manufacturer bundling policy, that's changed. I think a lot of this stuff in Q1 will get relaxed. That's kind of my theory and what I'm hearing from other sellers. That's kind of their sentiment as well. I mean, listen, Amazon's under a microscope during Q4. There's already plenty of class action lawsuits, tons of regulatory pressure, and they're trying. I think it's the FEC. Yeah, one of those is one of the 185 agencies we have in the United States is trying to categorize them as a distributor, which would essentially push all the liability onto them for what they sell, which they don't currently have, which would very much change a lot. So microscope, external pressure, Q4 is going to be interesting. We've already seen that happen. But I think Q1, when things start to kind of relax a little bit, they're less under pressure, or less under microscope, should I say. I think things will relax quite a lot. Oh yeah. Okay. So, can you please re-explain how you can tell if other competitors are constantly repricing? So you're really just watching the listing, right? If you're just refreshing this, and you can do this on the all offers modal when you're in Aura, you can just see that they're moving quite a bit. It's actually a little bit easier. I'm gonna use that mental model inversion for a second. Instead of looking to see if they're updating, look for the ones who are not updating, and that will kind of by necessity tell you which ones are. So there will be cases where only one competitor is not really changing their price ever. They just stay there, and you can tell they're not repricing. Like, you could basically take a screenshot of everybody's price in Aura, come back in 10 minutes, look at it, and see what changed. Because if somebody really hasn't updated their prices in 10 minutes, assuming there's enough activity on a listing, they're probably not repricing, like using a repricer.
I was just going to say another way, like, hypothetically, you could check is like the number of price updates Aura is making on that listing, because, chances are, if we're, repricing in response to somebody else, it's like assuming that they're targeting us and vice versa, like your strategy is targeting that offer. If Aura has, 1,000 price changes, per day on a certain listing, it's likely somebody else's that there's, relatively decent repricing activity. So, also look at what Aura is doing in response to others as well. The listings that, generally see and this kind of goes back to like what listings to use Hyperdrive on. Sometimes I actually like inform users. It's actually sometimes easier for me to tell you what ones not to use it on. And that would be like listings with like ultra high sales rank where there's very like little activity. Suppressed listings generally see less repricing activity. Those where it's just you and a handful of others, where the speed of Hyperdrive is not going to have a big impact. Sometimes I look at it that way.
Yeah. Great question though. Yeah. Some of these things are kind of harder to just say, like, here's exactly what to do, because there's some nuance to it.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what I like. And this kind of goes back to that first principles conversation, which is the pithy answer is easy and it sounds awesome, but most of the time it does miss the nuances. So the whole, well, I'm struggling with Amazon, we'll buy more inventory. I mean, yes, that is technically true, but if we want to get intelligent about it, we need to dive a little bit deeper. We need to look at your data. Like there's a lot of things. I mean, I got to a point where I was limited on capital to grow and I didn't want to take outside funding. So what I started to do was measure my average ROI across the entire account and then stack rank it highest to lowest. As I'm adding new wholesale accounts, I would basically trade a 12% ROI item for an 8% ROI item. Yes, it's profitable. Yes, I was buying at 8% on the low end. Why? Because 8% on my money in 2 weeks is better than 0% on my money. So there's a lot of financial manipulation you can do in terms of what you're deciding to buy and how you're buying and what to focus on. And I think I mentioned this in last week's office hours, but managerial accounting was the best. It was the most boring class I've ever taken, but it was the most impactful one because it helped me see through a different lens. And I was like, oh, what I'm measuring is the wrong thing in my wholesale business. I'm looking at sales. Sales is an output. I need to look at the inputs. I need to look at what I can control and what to focus on. And so I started to build that checklist of here's what I buy, here's what I don't buy. And there are times when I'm not going to buy that 8% ROI item, but in 3 months, I might do that because I have way more cash and I don't have an alternative. I'd rather get 8% than 0%. And so this is why personally, I'm a huge fan of using ROI using ROI over profit margin. Profit margin is far more accurate for a e-commerce company, for a product-led company. But I think ROI helps you think like an investor, because that's fundamentally what you're doing. Like if you're running a private label company, I think, yeah, you should do profit margin. I think it's a whole different ballgame. You have a lot more control there. With arbitrage models like wholesale, RA, OA, I think it's fundamentally different. And I think your approach needs to also fundamentally be different. And by viewing it as an investment, you understand, okay, well, I have a return, I have an interest that I expect to get, a profit. I have a timeline. Okay, well, I can control those things, right? I can buy 3 months worth of inventory. Does that make sense? Sometimes, other times, not really. Because if I'm going to buy 3 months of inventory, my capital's tied up. It's going to take much longer to get that back. But if I get such a steep discount, it's worth it now. But if I can't get a massive enough discount to warrant me locking up that much cash for that long, I'm not going to do that. I've said time and time again, you can spend $10,000 once in a month, or you can spend $10,000 twice in a month. Well, what's the difference? The difference is when I'm spending 10 grand once a month, I'm buying 30 days worth of inventory. So I compound once, right? I get my 20% once. If I want to spend it twice, then I buy 2 weeks worth of inventory, right? So I spent 10 grand in 2 weeks. I got 20% back. Let's call it 15. Let's say I got a lower ROI. I got 15% ROI. Great. So in 2 weeks, I got my 10 grand back. So I get to re-spend it, and I got my return on investment, whatever that happens to be, and I can spend that now. So is it better to get a 20% return on investment in 30 days or a 15% investment return compounded twice in 30 days? Whole different ballgame.
Amazon's a compounding game.
It is.
And this is why, during a lot of the onboarding calls that I do with users, when we talk about strategies, this is why I mentioned having like different levels of strategies for different levels of urgency, because your inventory has a life cycle. It's like Amazon doesn't want it in their warehouse any more than you want it there. And so it's in your interest to move it faster, because the sooner you can reclaim your capital and redeploy it, the more times you're going to be able to churn that within the same period of time. And that's why I tell people, it's like, don't see it as necessarily a failure, if you're not getting exactly the right ROI you're looking for, because sometimes it's a better business decision to accept a discount or have a lower ROI if it means you can reclaim your money, which is worth more today than it is in the future. And you can redeploy that into something else that's more profitable and can offset that, and that's why I'm also a fan of ROI. It's because it's a direct measurement of the performance of the capital that you're putting into your business, especially something as capital intensive as arbitrage or wholesale. You are measuring it based off of the amount that you put in. You say for every, $10,000 of inventory I put in, I expect to make a return of $3,000 when this all sells. And then once you get that money back, then you do it. I also say nobody generates significant wealth on Amazon by selling through your inventory once and being done.
Right.
It's how quickly can you reclaim it and redeploy it. And then, the seller who compounds their money, 8 times, 10 times in a year at a lower ROI makes more money than the same seller who holds their minimum ROIs higher and only turns it twice in a year. So that's kind of the framework that I like to, to teach users, especially in terms of like strategies with our, when setting up Aura and onboarding calls, is because strategies should really directly tie to the level of urgency you have, which naturally will increase in a certain period of time.
Yeah. And you really want to think about the opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost is basically, if I do A, I now cannot do B. So now I have to decide, is B more valuable than A, or is A more valuable than B? I now have to make a decision. So the interesting thing, because I know some sellers are like, I only buy like 3 months worth of inventory. I'm like, that's great. Sounds great. What happens when all your capital's tied up and you get an insane deal? You now can't take on that deal. Can't do it. You don't have the capital for it. So there's something about having enough liquidity, meaning how fast you're turning your inventory, you're replenishing your coffers, so to speak, to be able to take on that. Because if I buy 3 months worth of inventory, and sometimes this does make sense. So again, there's nuances to this, but just speaking simplistically for a moment, if I buy 3 months worth of inventory, and let's say it's 20% ROI and it was 10 grand in total. Okay, that 10 grand's gone. I can't resubmit it now because it's locked up. I gotta wait 3 months. But what happens when because you should be doing this, even if you don't have capital to spend, you should still be opening new accounts. Let's say I get an account and I have an insane thing. I can make 50% ROI and I can move way more units. And now I could spend 10 grand every month on that instead of 10 grand over 3 months. Well, now I can't take on that opportunity because my capital is locked up. But if I said, okay, well, I know I'm going to not get that 3 month discount. So, I'm ordering 3 months worth of inventory. That's naturally higher, inventory levels. Therefore, I should get some kind of discount in theory. If I didn't get that intentionally, but I was still very profitable, let's say instead of 20%, I was 15% ROI. I traded 5%. And I'm only going to buy 2 weeks worth of inventory, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever. Well, now I don't have to wait 3 months to take on that situation. I could take it on in a week or two. Right. And so like this level of thinking through it is the lever you pull to scale fast. And this is what your bigger sellers are doing. When they're sitting down analyzing their business, this is what they're doing. The sourcing is important, but that's the execution. All the stuff we're talking about right now is the strategy behind how you execute. Just buying profitable inventory is good enough to make 10 grand a month. But if you're really trying to build a real company, a real business here, that's not the most important part. It's the strategy that is leading and directing you on how to spend that money. And it's a very different ball game. And that's what I learned, right? When I started to scale wholesale, I was like, well, what's the actual difference here in my level and a 7-figure seller? Well, volume. Okay, that makes sense. They spend more. Okay, yeah, that's the piffy answer, right? They spend more money. But that's not first principles. That's the simplistic thing. Well, how do they do it? How do they do it differently than I do? How are they making decisions differently than I'm making decisions? Because there's things you're going to learn when you run a 7-figure business that you can't learn at 6 figures, but you have to learn along the journey. Well, if you understand really how a 7-figure business works and you're doing that same business at 6 figures and you reverse engineer it using that first principles, all that good stuff, well, now you know how to do it. Now it's just doing it, right? So I feel like a lot of sellers are kind of lost at sea. They're still going somewhere, still making progress, but they haven't really defined where they're going and how, most importantly, how they're going to get there. And this is that whole map is not the territory kind of thing, but this is the level of conversations that you need to be having with yourself, with your peers, and your Discord groups, all these different things. It's like, what are the algorithms, the decisions, the steps, the processes that will allow us to massively scale up? And this is why I like about the leverage mental model, because you can sit down and say, okay, well, I'm going to go 10% per month. That's iterative. That's not leverage. I want to think exponential. How could I 10x the amount of money I'm spending per month? And then try to solve that. You're not going to get perfect. You have no idea. But at least by trying to solve that problem, you're giving yourself the direction. So a good example, when I was doing RA, I was like, okay, I'm doing, a few hundred units a month. And I asked myself this question: how could I purchase 50,000 units as easily as me purchasing 50 units. That was the exact prompt. Well, if I needed to do that with RA, I'd have to hire a crap ton of people. Like, that's just insane. OA back then, not much software, a little harder. You could do it, but still tough. Still got to hire people to source. Wholesale popped into the mind though, because is it more work for me to add a few zeros to my PO? No, it's not. And I'm not doing the prep. I have a prep center. So does it take any more work from me? Any more time from me? Well, no. So that's a leveraged decision. So now my hourly value massively increased. Because now, instead of me spending a week trying to spend 10 grand to an RA, I can spend that on one PO in 30 minutes. And I can rinse and repeat it. This is why people go wholesale. This is the sole reason. It's more ROI on your time, and it's highly leveraged. Because talking about leverage, capital leverage, right? Different versions of that. You can raise money. Certainly, you can use net terms with wholesale. You can say, cool, got a good relationship. I know my velocity on this. I know how much I can sell it. Hey, listen, I want net 30. Awesome. Sounds good. Let's scale it up. So if I have net 30 and I'm buying 2 weeks worth of inventory, do I not have a buffer of 2 weeks? I do. So now I'm not getting tied up in debt or anything like that. And now the available capital I have is not just my cash. I could have net 30 terms with all my suppliers. And let's say I'm spending 100 grand a month. Well, if I have net 30, if I have 100 grand cash, net 30 with all my suppliers that I could spend 100 grand with, I now have what? $200,000. This is financial engineering in a simplistic form. But when we're talking leverage, this is the kind of stuff you really want to be looking at. That's not to say OA and RA are not great. That's not what I'm saying. But when you want to understand why are so many people trying to go wholesale, this is the reason. Well, why do so many people want to go private label? Different type of leverage. Because you can build a brand and you can exit it for some multiple revenue in a few years and have a big windfall. It's a different type of leverage work. You're trading cash flow today and the next few years for a massive windfall later. Could be a few million. Wholesale is a different type.
Up front.
Yeah, totally.
You have to build brand equity as opposed to, just reselling something that is already potentially a household name. But
for sure.
You now, also wouldn't be able to exit,
Yeah. And now going back to opportunity costs, there's not just opportunity costs for your inventory and your capital, there's opportunity costs for your time. If you're spending 10, 12 hours a day doing RA and you're kind of capped at what you can do, well, the opportunity cost is you could be working on wholesale, private label, something along those lines that would pay off far greater. You're going to take a dip making that transition, but then you rocket ship up. So this is what's nice about a lot of these concepts and mental models. You can apply it everywhere. I mean, literally everywhere. This is why people get VAs. Why? Well, because I can trade $8 an hour for somebody else's time to do something that now frees me up. I have more capacity to do higher level things. Leverage.
That's why people use prep centers or pricers. It's time. As you grow, these are bottlenecks that you're going to either have to manage yourself or outsource.
Yeah, I can go, rent, or I can lease a warehouse and hire 5 people, and now I have to manage them. By the way, and that's a whole thing. I got overhead now, or I could just pay a prep center and not have to think about it ever again. And I'm going to pay more per unit. Yeah, for sure. $1 per unit versus a fixed cost kind of a thing. Certainly. But I think a lot of people are trying to scale something that's not there yet. You know what I mean? Like, listen, when you're doing tens of thousands of units a month, they might start to make sense for you to switch from $1 per unit to 20 cents per unit in-house, certainly. But you want to be at a variable cost, meaning per unit in the early days. And when your fixed cost becomes lower than the variable cost in total, then you go fixed costs. That's when you, and by fixed costs, I mean, you get a warehouse that costs $2,000 a month, always, no matter how much volume you're doing and all that stuff.
And that actually gets cheaper. The inverse happens once you
exactly
scale past that.
Now you have some efficiency, laws of scale, things of that nature. But when you don't have a lot of time, when you're building out the business, getting started, you got to focus on the leverage. What's the most useful time, task for your time? Certainly not prepping. Listen, if you're prepping your own stuff at any level, I don't know what you're doing. So we got about 10 minutes here. I know we're kind of riffing. This is good because I like to get down to like this nitty gritty stuff, right? Because our whole thing is like, I want you to think differently. I think if I can help you do that, you'll be more successful. So we got about 10 minutes left here for any questions that anybody has. Again, open office hours. There's no format here. If you have any questions related to repricing, to Aura specifically, any feedback, anything like that, we're happy to dive deep into all those rabbit holes with you. Now I have to pick a blog post for next week, a new topic. I want to write more about mental models, but I feel like that's a lifelong pursuit. But definitely check out Farnham Street. Yeah, fs.blog. That I forget the guy's name, the founder, but it's his entire focus, which is like awesome. Super cool. Awesome. So we'll give it a few more minutes here, and then we'll let you get back to the rest of your day.
Kind of going back to, this is like kind of loosely related, but, in terms of like opportunity cost, that is something that, at least in terms of repricing, that's something that a different strategy can help, even help with, maybe if you have a bunch of inventory, let's just say all your capital is tied up at Amazon, it's like there are ways you can expedite liquidating your inventory by lowering your minimum prices and putting a more aggressive strategy on, that is a way to kind of pull that lever of that capital. You will likely get it at a discount versus letting it sell at the, using Maven, to get the best, balance of sales and profitability. But, it's also opportunity cost too. It's like, how much more is that money worth today, if you then deploy it into another opportunity? That is all opportunity cost.
Time value of money. I know you know that, Finn. The amount of times finance majors have to do present value money, time value money, all that good stuff.
Money is always worth more today than it is tomorrow.
Yeah, I saw my TI-84 somewhere. Thing was the best. See, last question here. We'll wrap up. What do you recommend for a new seller like me who's only been doing this for a month and a half? Do you think we should steer clear of selling on Amazon as FBM? Not necessarily. It's also Q4, right? So you're kind of in this weird place where already we're starting to see slowing down in logistics and check-in times. I'm starting to hear some chatter already.
Very slow.
I think unless you've already packed out FBA, to get the most out of Amazon for Q4, you're probably going to have to do FBM. I don't think you should steer clear of FBM. I used to be very anti FBM because it's very manual. You got to do it, prep it, blah, blah, blah. But again, everything I say, there's an inverse where you should do those things. So I think right now, Q4 timeline, you probably should be doing that. I think it's going to be the best use of your time because getting new accounts, purchasing new inventory, you're just not going to be able to get it into FBA really in time. And you probably have a few more weeks.
Atrocious check-in times. Like from what I've seen, in different communities and groups, it's like 6+ week check-in times at certain fulfillment centers that they're turning away. Like you can't get a delivery, a delivery appointment. Sometimes they're turning away shipments, and the other thing too is, I believe I saw an email from FBA like a month and a half ago saying, if you want guaranteed fulfillable inventory by Black Friday, it needed to be there like virtually a month ago. So, and from what we've been seeing, like on our end, I've actually been seeing, a lot of FBM offers winning the buy box more now than all the back-ordered FBAs who's just waiting to get in and getting shuffled around. So the answer is no. I don't think you should steer clear of it, especially right now. That might change in Q1, but FBM might actually be an advantage right now, especially relative to like just sending it in now. If you were to do FBA, I think you would actually have an advantage.
Yeah, I agree. Great question, by the way. Awesome. So I think with that, we'll let you get back to the rest of your week. Enjoy it. I know it was a long weekend, so hopefully you got to turn off and relax a little bit, or source more. You do you. But listen, we're I think officially in peak season now, so keep that in mind. Adjust yourselves, your strategies. Don't be trying to pump in FBA stuff if you know it's not going to get checked in until Q1 at this point. Like, really start to think about these things. So you might need to start to transition your newer stuff that's not already checked in into FBM. I think that's going to be your best kind of scenario. A lot more work on your front. You got to be shipping stuff out, but listen, you got to change your strategy as the reality changes itself. So, I'm so used to saying Casey. I was about to say Casey. Finn, appreciate you jumping in for Casey and filling in his seat, man.
Dylan, thank you. Always a pleasure. I hope everybody gets something useful from this, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, and last thing I will say, you guys know I always push doing onboardings. This is the guy you're going to do an onboarding with. So it's always with Finn. So if you have not scheduled an onboarding, please reach out to support and live chat and just say, hey, I want an onboarding. We're happy to do it. It's like 20-ish minutes. We'll take you from.
I will make you an expert in repricing.
Yeah, exactly. So well worth it. It's free. We don't care if you're in a trial, anything. We don't care. We don't care how much you're paying us. We just want to make sure you're properly set up, getting the most out of it, especially going into this peak season. So with that, we'll let you get back to the rest of your week. Enjoy it, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Have a good week.